What is happening, everybody? James Hancock here, back to review the Season 2 premiere of Noah Hawley's Legion. But before I dive into my review and recap of Chapter 9 of the show, I just want to say a few quick words about Season 1. While it wounds my ego and sense of pride to ever admit that I'm wrong, I have to admit that I was quite wrong about Season 1. I gave up on Season 1 after the second episode, and looking back, I feel like quite a fool for having done so, because while Season 1 was not what I expected it to be, nor envisioned it to be, it was precisely what the superhero genre needs in film and television to keep the genre from becoming stale and repetitive. Because of my love of the source material by Chris Claremont and Bill Sienkiewicz, I think I tripped over my own feet in the way I was digesting Season 1, because way back when, Chris Claremont and artist John Byrne did a story where Professor X went up against Amul Farak, the Shadow King, and it was this killer depiction of astral combat. And so I just assumed that the show Legion would be an extension of the X-Men cinematic universe, which is a really silly reason to get upset about a show, because what I should have been focusing on is that this is a Noah Hawley show, and Noah Hawley gave us 3 incredibly satisfying seasons of Fargo. We can debate which seasons are the better ones. I think Season 2 is probably the strongest, followed by 1, followed by 3, but I know there's a lot of debate in the Fargo community about which season is the strongest. But obviously Noah Hawley is one of the most original and groundbreaking and innovative storytelling voices in television today. And I love how Noah Hawley took some of these characters and ideas from the X-Men comics from way back when, created this really unusual atmospheric show featuring an unreliable central character when it comes to his point of view and his memories and what experiences he might be having. I feel like when it comes to superhero genre entertainment, a lot of times we get very preoccupied with the shared universe and the continuity and how things are interconnected. But whether one wants to nerd out totally and just say, oh, well, Legion takes place on a parallel universe that's related to the X-Men universe, or it's just a standalone thing to be enjoyed for its own sake, Noah Hawley gave the superhero genre precisely what it needs right now. As we see more shows and more movies than ever before, there is a giant risk of creative stagnation or people playing it too safe and just giving us more of the same with more characters and more costumes without actually pushing the genre forward. And I feel like if you don't have shows or movies every once in a while that really break some new ground, this whole superhero phenomenon is rapidly going to become creatively irrelevant. So while David Haller, aka Legion, might be an unreliable narrator, it seems like Noah Hawley is a very reliable narrator, because I binged Season 1 a couple days ago and I was absolutely floored by it. The Shadow King I found genuinely disturbing at times, but other times I found the Shadow King strangely erotic because of Aubrey Plaza. I have a giant crush on Aubrey Plaza. I think she's funny as hell and sexy beyond words. I loved a lot of the dance sequences, and what I really loved was the depiction of astral combat on a chalkboard in Season 1. I thought that was absolutely killer. If you look at Season 1 overall, if you're interested in telekinesis or telepathy, it's probably got the best depictions of astral combat that we've seen to date. And what's tricky and kind of slippery about reviewing a show like this is that in that so much of the show is subjective from the character's point of view, and some of these characters are slightly unhinged or outright insane, it's going to be a little bit more difficult to do a scene-by-scene breakdown of what goes down. But I feel like if we just talk about images and impressions and emotions that we love, I feel like the rest will kind of take care of itself. Which brings us to Season 2, and I think it has come roaring out of the gate with a fantastic first episode. I like how they're giving the episodes just names like Chapter 9, so we know it's just a continuation of the previous story. But if people didn't bother to stick around until after the credits at the end of Season 1, they might have missed entirely that David basically got kidnapped by this strange metallic orb floating in the sky at the very end of the season. And after an interesting opening sequence where we see Oliver and Lenny basically bronzing themselves in a pool having cocktails, we see that David is discovered in this nightclub. And much of the beginning of this episode is trying to figure out where the hell David's been, because as we learn, David's been gone for a year, and during that time, all of his friends and allies have gone to work for Division 3. They're much more organized, and they're basically trying to find and combat the Shadow King whenever he appears around the world. Whenever he appears, he creates this event called the Catalyst, which is really eerie and really creepy. I mean, we see at the beginning of the episode where he basically leaves people with these chattering teeth and they're totally comatose. It's almost like a telepathic, nightmarish version of the gas that the Joker uses in DC Comics. If they continue along these lines, I feel like the Shadow King stands a very good chance of becoming one of the most interesting superhero villains in the history of television, because this is not a villain that people put on their tights and punch in the face. You have to fight and resist him in a completely different way. In any case, David wakes up and immediately wants waffles. And one of the things I love most about Legion in every episode is the way they introduce the title of the show. It's always always different, but as he asks for waffles, we see waffles floating by in a little sailboat, and it's one of many gorgeous shots this episode that's in the 2.35 to 1 aspect ratio. I love how a lot of shows are doing that these days, where it kind of goes back and forth between 2.35 to 1 and 1.85 to 1, and when done well, it's basically invisible and it just serves a dramatic effect. But it just makes these shows seem so much more cinematic and so much more epic. John Carpenter very famously said, if you're making a low budget movie and you immediately want to make it look like a larger budget movie, if you just add a matte onto your camera so that your images are all 2.35 to 1, people immediately think you're doing some big budget extravaganza, and it's a technique he employed on a lot of his early movies in the 1970s. And speaking on a technical level, I strongly urge people to watch this show with their headphones on. I was watching for a little while with the headphones off, but I put them on and I was blown away by the level of sound design, especially when you get into some of the more musical sequences. If there's one thing that this show does better than almost any other show out there, is when it goes into these almost stream of consciousness scenes where it doesn't necessarily make complete narrative sense, but between the photography and the emotion and the music and the overall atmosphere, it just takes us to a place that TV very rarely takes us. Case in point is when Sid is reunited with David, and she basically demands that he kiss her, and they have a nice little moment, but it transitions to this great scene where first they're all in white in this all-white room removing each other's clothes, but then it goes to like a neon blue, and it was just a wonderfully erotic atmospheric scene. And I love how this show is just totally blissfully unconcerned with traditional narrative storytelling. Halfway through this episode, it basically hits the pause button and gives us a little video essay on the notion of delusion and how they take root, and how a delusion left unaddressed can evolve and grow into a full-blown psychosis. But we get this really interesting sequence that's initially quite beautiful, where somebody's imagining that they became a butterfly and they're not sure if they're a butterfly imagining they're human, or if they're a human dreaming that they're a butterfly. But then we get this other sickening sequence where you see somebody has started to get the idea that his leg does not belong to him and doesn't cooperate with him, and this idea grows to the point where we see him in a shower with a hacksaw just taking his leg off him. It's absolutely nightmarish stuff. And we get these really interesting comparisons where we see these beautiful little chickens hatching from eggs, but we also see this horrible, gelatinous, black, oozing creature also hatching from eggs. And it's a perfect visual representation of how the Shadow King basically grew like a cancer inside David's mind. And that if you allow a delusion to thrive, it basically starts to push out all other rational ideas until it becomes full-blown insanity. But it's just beautiful filmmaking. But in terms of lore building, we have some interesting scenes with Clark. And Clark's talking about how they believe that Amul Farak basically came to be in Morocco back in the 1800s. And it's very much consistent with his origin from the Uncanny X-Men way back in the day. It was this incredible sequence, and it only lasted a couple of pages, and I believe it was one of Professor X's first encounters with another mutant. But he basically went into a cafe in Morocco, saw Amul Farak, they sat down at opposing tables, went into the astral plane, had this incredible battle sequence in their minds, and at the very end of it, Amul Farak collapsed to the ground. And Professor X got up from the table with all these burns on his back, but as drawn by John Byrne, it was absolutely gorgeous, stunning stuff. But one of my favorite details of season 2 is this character, Fukuyama, almost like a robotic character with like a beekeeper suit helmet on, with these 3 mustached women who operate as his spokespeople. I'm still trying to wrap my head around who this character is and what this character represents, but I feel like if you're a fan of David Lynch, and I feel like David Lynch's Twin Peaks is very obviously a major influence on Noah Hawley. But I feel like a character like this, who communicates like this, is as vague and ambiguous as this, is probably one of the most clear, overt nods to the atmosphere of David Lynch that Noah Hawley has inserted into this show. But what we learn basically is that the Shadow King is desperately trying to look for his body, and that if he is reunited with his body, he'll become completely unstoppable. As powerful as David Haller might be, he is completely dwarfed by Amul Farak if Amul Farak is able to become whole again. And I think that's an interesting premise for the season. It's basically, this is going to be a race. I mean, who knows? In a show as unpredictable as this one, it'll probably zig and zag in a lot of directions, but it seems as if that is going to be the main thrust of this season. Who's going to find Amul Farak's body first? But there's an interesting twist. Carrie comes up with this device, this immersive tank that jacks up David's powers and allows him to explore some of his memories from when he was inside that orb. And we get this crazy dance sequence in a nightclub where the Shadow King and his minions and David and his followers all kind of face off in this elaborate dance contest. But as David tries to figure out what his memories are from the time when he was in this orb, he remembers this moment where Sid came to him, or at least in theory, possibly Sid came to him from the future to deliver a message, and she was just writing in these kind of abstract symbols and images. But the idea basically is that David needs to help Amul Farak be reunited with his body. The exact opposite of what Division 3 wants to happen. So very clearly from the outset of the season, we're seeing that David's going to be at odds with Division 3. And if you stuck around for the final teaser, there's an additional twist where we see that Carrie starts to believe that the orb that kidnapped David very well might have been designed by Carey in the future. So with the show as weird and strange and atmospheric as this one already is, why not introduce the idea of time travel and time paradoxes as well? Because clearly this show is incredibly ambitious from a story construction standpoint, and I just can't wait to see where the season might lead. Also, because this show is so wildly open to interpretation and so much of it has like a dreamlike atmosphere, if people out there think I have a completely, totally wrong read on things, definitely let me know. I'm not saying I'll immediately jump over to your point of view, but I definitely want to hear how different people are interpreting the season, because I think looking at it from a strict, linear, kind of rigid perspective is the precisely wrong way to go about enjoying this show. So while I remain incredibly embarrassed that I totally overlooked season 1 while it was ongoing, better late than never. I'm thrilled to have been so wrong about season 1 initially, and I'm glad that I finally came around. I'm absolutely in love with the show, and I look forward to reviewing it in real time throughout the rest of season 2. So in any case, if you enjoyed my reaction and review, please consider giving my channel a subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. I'm going to be tackling a ton of shows this spring. I'm already following The Americans, but I'm definitely going to be jumping on board with The Expanse and Westworld. But if you want to give me a shout about TV or film, feel free to leave a comment in the comments below or give me a shout on Twitter @Colbrax. And I'll be back at y'all tomorrow night to review the latest episode of The Americans. So long.